I want to just thank y'all for having me today. It means a lot to me personally to be here. I will say that my photos will not live up to Mark's, but I hope that y'all will enjoy them. This is just going to be a looping presentation as I go through. Okay. Let's see if it goes. So I've attended numerous cultural crossroads over the years and happily escorted my grandmother, Mary Ann, for the day, standing patiently while most of you, if not all of you, stopped her and picked her brain about anything and everything. And sometimes I would be the inadequate stand-in, struggling to answer questions or carry a conversation until she was done and the line could progress to the next conversation. And waiting to tell her about their Confederate ancestor or ask her a question about Governor Bibb or Matthew Blue. She was an inspiration to so many and a role model for me. Now, here I am, presenting at the very event she worked tirelessly every year to organize. In those years, sitting patiently, listening to the countless historians and storytellers come through and discuss the early years of Alabama, walking with my grandmother through the halls of the museum and then the archives, soaking in as much information as I could, I found myself thinking about the topic, the story that I would present to this group. I watched my cousin Graham tell us the story of Peter Brannon and his band of gentlemen archaeologists last year, and I always imagined I would tell some dramatic story I'd uncovered in months of research that would have you on the edge of your seat the entire 30 minutes I was up here. Something that would lead to my first book. So when Catherine asked me to present this year in the wake of my grandmother's passing, and in the midst of a mountain of National Register nominations, a federal government shutdown, and the end of year record keeping, I tried to conceive a story of architecture that was relevant to the federal road and tell you the story that was worth hearing. Instead of a story, some masterful piece of historical research with a dramatic conclusion, I come to you with a plea of sorts. Now, I'm a historian by birth, but a preservationist by trade. I use buildings to tell the story about our past and preserve our future. Preservation seeks to democratize community development. It accounts for the built environment that represents where our society has been and gives the community an input on how the future is shaped. Keep this in mind as I progress. In my time in historic preservation in Alabama, I've had the honor of visiting, researching, and fighting for numerous important and stunning places in our state. But there's one place that, to my consternation, has captured my attention more than anywhere. The old Mount Vernon Arsenal and Searcy Hospital. This place is one of intrigue and mystery that has long held captive the imaginations of folks in Lower Alabama. When I first came across Searcy, it was a project handed to me by the State Historic Preservation Officer. I was told to take it and run with it. After countless site visits, venturing into the collapsing buildings and the jungle-like cemeteries, I've come to recognize the immensity of this place. It was an arsenal charged with supplying the United States southern and western defenses in the first half of the 19th century and the early sentinel of a distant federal government. It served as a POW camp at the end of America's Indian Wars, holding one of the country's fiercest and infamous native warriors. And finally, an underfunded and segregated hospital for Alabamians with mental illnesses. A story like this is not necessarily unique to Alabama, but Mount Vernon Searcy is unique in Alabama. There are few, if any, places that serve the public of Alabama and reflect our state's history the way Searcy does. It represents an optimism of a bright future in frontier Alabama and the despair of segregation, racism, and the struggle to efficiently care for the mentally ill in the United States, issues that continue to plague our society today. This story stretches the theme of the day because it's a story of the legacy of the Federal Road. In ways, it is the story of a place that contributed to the continual use of a rough path cut through the piney woods and eastern prairies of Alabama. Searcy Mount Vernon is one of the many places on that path that have faded from the collective memory of Alabama, but its buildings and its walls remain. The weight of its past hangs heavy with the humidity, and it's time we recognize it and tell its story, for we may not have it much longer. Mount Vernon, Alabama sits on U.S. Highway 43 just before it crosses over the Mobile County line into Washington County. At the beginning of the 19th century, this was America's southern border, a hot, humid subtropical place at the confluence of two major waterways in the Old Southwest, the Tombigbee River and the Alabama River, roughly 6 miles north of Ellicott Stone. Fort Stoddart sat at the terminus of the old federal road, the farthest reach of the federal government, a stockade fort which represented the cutting edge of military fortifications at the time. It was a primary defensive position and the official border crossing for the United States out of Spanish Florida. The fort itself stood for about 15 years, and I'm sure it was the most desirable post for early American soldiers of the day. There was comings and goings with trade moving from what was then Mississippi territory through the border onto Mobile, and generally the posting was hot, humid, and laden with mosquitoes. Undoubtedly, it was miserable with long periods of boredom. However, there are two significant events most students of Alabama history may be casually aware of if they didn't know that the events themselves took place at Stoddart. The first is Aaron Burr's brief time at the fort as a prisoner in 1807, awaiting for his eventual trial in Richmond. And secondly, the continued use of Stoddart as a forward operating base for the Mississippi Territorial Militia and federal troops during the War of 1812 and the First Creek War. During the time of Stoddart's period of operation, soldiers constructed a cantonment on a hill to the southwest of the fort, overlooking the terrain of the Tennessee Delta and the approach from Spanish Florida. Now, a cantonment in the 18th and 19th centuries was more or less a temporary quarters for troops. In the United States, the easiest example to recognize would be Washington's camp at Valley Forge. Unlike Valley Forge, Stoddart's cantonment was occupied more than once, as it served as a rendezvous point for Wilkinson's attack on Mobile in 1813, Wilkinson's attack in 1813, and Jackson's army in 1814, and various other times in the period leading up to and after the abandonment of Fort Stoddart, shortly after the War of 1812. The local understanding is this: Stoddart was close to the river and oftentimes uninhabitable during rainy periods, and the cantonment offered high ground for the garrison to continue operations. This cantonment became known as the Mount Vernon Cantonment, and in 1824 it was chosen by Congress as the site of the new Mount Vernon Arsenal. The arsenal officially began operations in 1828, manufacturing weapons and ammunition for a new string of U.S. coastal defenses along the Gulf Coast. The official congressional designation of Mount Vernon Arsenal included an appropriation of a substantial amount in those days to construct a wall, an interior fence, as well as the necessary buildings to house the arms manufacturing elements of the arsenal and the small garrison, officers, and support personnel posted there. Despite the small stature of the U.S. Army and the federal purse at the time, the federal government recognized a need to efficiently defend its newly won southern coastal holdings, with a series of masonry forts guarding the entrance of every major port in the South, from Wilmington to Galveston. Mount Vernon was the beginning of this massive project. The scale, engineering talent, and resource expenditure taken to accomplish this feat should be recognized as one of the most impressive building projects in U.S. history. It should also be pointed out that these forts instantly and swiftly were rendered obsolete 30 years later with the implementation of rifled artillery on the battlefield, but I digress. The construction project for Mount Vernon is the first of three significant building periods in the site's history. According to the National Register nomination written by Devereux Bemis, it is evident that there was a uniform plan for federal arsenals during this time, and the plans were adapted to each site. As previously stated, the site sits on a hill, the summit of which was graded level and houses the three-story arsenal building with supporting framed gun sheds and the parade ground. Circled around the parade ground were a handful of masonry buildings, including officers' quarters, a subaltern's quarters, blacksmith and carpenter shops, public offices, and two armorer's shops. These buildings were the inner core and were surrounded by a heavy picket fence. The entire post was surrounded by a thick masonry wall, 12 feet tall. It surrounded the arsenal with three primary gates: its southern gate on the road to Mobile, eastern gate, which was the main gate, on the road to Old Fort Stoddart and the western gate toward St. Stephen's. The wall stretched a mile long in a rough horseshoe shape, utilizing the deep ravine to the southeast as defensive topography. Between the wall and the picket fence were various frame buildings, including barracks and storage buildings, and the 2 magazines were outside the wall. Of all the buildings built in this period in support of the arsenal operations, only 14 masonry buildings remain. Those around the old parade ground, a small section of the picket fence, and most of the wall. All of the remaining buildings are significant because of their unique construction and integrity of setting and feeling they provide to the entire complex. Once the hospital took over the site, these buildings remained in use well into the 2000s. However, the arsenal is distinct. There is only one other arsenal from this period of federal military design, the Kennebec Arsenal in Augusta, Maine, which is a part of a National Historic Landmark District and official designation of the National Park Service. I will discuss the importance and preservation of these buildings on the site later on. The arsenal maintained production until the breakout of the Civil War, when Alabama seized the arsenal shortly after secession, eventually turning the arsenal over to the Confederacy for arms production. After the war, the arsenal resumed its status as the arms manufacturer until it stopped arms production in the 1870s, but maintained its status as an Army post until 1895, when the Army turned it over to the state of Alabama. During this time, few additions were made to the built environment of the post. A kitchen and mess were added inside the walls, a few cottages outside the main gate. These buildings still stand today. The Arsenal building was also converted into a primary enlisted barracks during this time. Between the end of the arms production and the closing of the post, Mount Vernon was a sleepy, out-of-the-way posting focused mainly on contributing to the needs of a growing force, aiding an ongoing war in the West against a native enemy, and supporting an ever-growing needs of a military taking an international role. 2 individuals vital in both of those new theaters of operation were at Mount Vernon in this time. The first is the infamous Geronimo and his band of Chiricahua Apaches. The second is a young Walter Reed. The Apache internment is a significant piece of Mount Vernon's history, though brief, only lasting from 1887 to 1894, when the Apaches were moved to a permanent reservation at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Their time at Mount Vernon is only addressed in the simplest of terms. Archaeology has been done at the location of the Apache camp just outside the walls, but not much has been published on the experience of the Apache, U.S. soldiers, or locals during this time. There are various accounts of the U.S. commander allowing the Apache to hunt during the day, but requiring them to be back at post by nightfall. The natives were severely affected by tuberculosis, and it is known that they would sneak off post to bury their dead in the middle of the night. It is not known where these burials are. While the Apache were interned at Mount Vernon, they were a spectacle for the locals, with anecdotes of people visiting with Geronimo or seeing them out and about when they were allowed to leave post. Not much is recorded about Walter Reed's time at Mount Vernon either. Though it coincided with the Chiricahua Apaches, it was before his time as an epidemiologist for the Army, and his posting at Mount Vernon is merely coincidental. The post closed in 1895, shortly after the Apache left, and the property was turned over to the state of Alabama. Once it was vacated, it took some time for the state to plan for a practical use for the facility. However, by 1900, the legislature appropriated the funds for the property to be converted to a hospital for African American patients at Bryce in an attempt to alleviate overcrowding at the state psychiatric hospital. In 1902, the first groups of patients and medical staff had been transferred to the former military barracks that were renamed the Mount Vernon Hospital. For the next 67 years, the hospital would be the primary care facility of the state's African American psychiatric patients. Now, before I go any further, I do need to say this. In no way do the things I'm about to say here represent the views of the Alabama Historical Commission or the state of Alabama. The story of the hospital complex is complex and difficult to grasp because it is fraught with anecdote, a lack of primary source material, conjecture, and a controlled narrative. Most of the primary documentation about this period is protected by HIPAA, has been lost or destroyed, or simply has not been found and analyzed. And an oral history work has not been done to efficiently inform the situation either. Most secondary material I'm familiar with says the same thing in a frustratingly repetitive manner. That's the basic narrative that I will give you now, informed by my own interpretation and another source uncovered by my brain trust who are not here today. All of this being said, when recounting the story of the hospital period, it is hard to discern the truth from the Gothic stereotype of a psychiatric hospital. In 1900, the legislature appropriated $25,000 for the renovation of the complex. Work included the additions of a kitchen, laundry, and heating and lighting plant. In May 1902, 318 patients and 25 employees, including one doctor and one physician's assistant, were moved from Bryce into refurbished military barracks and occupying the other buildings on the site left by the Army. A patient's ward was built near the west gate, and the administrative building was constructed at the east gate. This is the primary neoclassical revival building we see today at the main gate. Over time, the hospital grew with the addition of more buildings in the 1930s, 1940s, the 1970s, and the 1980s, in an attempt to maintain proper conditions for the staff and patients. The general understanding of life at Searcy is pretty mundane, just a hospital that took care of its residential patients and occasionally providing medical treatment for the surrounding community when necessary. Records would probably support this. However, in the early years of the hospital, patients repeatedly came down with an ailment that was quite mysterious at the time. Their skin would chafe and flake. It would burn easily in the sun. They had constant bouts of diarrhea and experienced hair loss and dementia. After some considerable study, the medical team with the Alabama State Insane Hospitals Board determined that the consistent outbreaks was a disease known as Italian pellagra, a dietary disease caused by a diet low in niacin and tryptophan. They weren't getting enough meat in their diet. The disease is deadly, and in a 1906 article of the Transactions of the Medical Association of the State of Alabama, George Searcy accounts for the experience of determining the cause of this outbreak. He states this disease was common with the opening of the hospital, and most cases proved fatal, though few in number. However, he states, the 1906 autumn outbreak was the exception with 88 cases and 57 deaths. From this outbreak, we can surmise the patients were poorly fed, but at this period in time, Southern poor folks suffered from pellagra as their diet was not fortified with niacin. This disease would become especially present in the spring among Southerners whose diet was almost entirely supported by cornmeal, and it was nicknamed the spring sickness. Dr. James T. Searcy, the superintendent of the State Board of Bryce, his son George, an MD, and the Mount Vernon Hospital supervising physician E.L. McCafferty treated and observed their patients over time. Searcy recorded the findings in an article published in the Journal of American Medical Associations in 1907 and has been given credit by other pellagra researchers for informing the ongoing studies that lasted well into the 1940s, when the federal government eventually required producers to fortify their bread and flour supplies with nutrients key in preventing pellagra. This is a major piece of medicine to come out of Searcy Hospital, preventing the malnutrition of its patients. The hospital was named for James Searcy in 1919. Searcy Hospital operated as Alabama's psychiatric hospital for African Americans until 1969, when, in the second of such attempts, the state was forced to desegregate all public institutions. A desegregation attempt was made under Governor Lurleen Wallace in 1967, but after her husband came to power, he abruptly reversed course. The 30 or so Searcy patients sent to Bryce and the 30 or so Bryce patients sent to Searcy were returned to their rightful place under segregation, and a chance at federal aid had been missed. Like many public institutions under the segregationist government of Alabama, the Alabama Department of Mental Health missed out on the support of the federal government and its public health initiatives. However, Searcy's suffering was twofold because its patients were mentally ill and, even worse, black. According to an article published in the Southern Courier on the weekend of January 28th, 29th of 1967, entitled "How Desegregation Worked Out at Bryce," Bryce Hospital served 5,000 patients, including 400 African Americans housed in a segregated building known as the Bryce Rapid Treatment Center. It had 21 medical doctors, 5 of whom were certified psychiatrists, 6 psychologists, 18 social workers, and 30 registered nurses. Compared to Searcy, on the other hand, which had 2,500 patients with 5 doctors, none of whom were certified psychiatrists, 1 psychologist, 3 social workers, and 4 registered nurses. To further highlight the inequality, all of the professional staff at Searcy were white. As an official policy of the Alabama Department of Mental Health, no African Americans above the position of attendant were hired. The pay brackets were determined by race and sex before merit was considered for all positions, with white males being paid the most, black females the least. Of course, it is easy to understand that a state institution in the time of segregation directed more resources to white institutions rather than the black ones. We see this repeatedly from hospitals and libraries, public schools, transportation, and the construction of infrastructure to laws supporting redlining, bank loans, and so on. Now, when researching the segregated hospital, one of the few publicly available resources is the aforementioned Southern Courier. It is the best known to this author and informs this next series. This newspaper, headquartered in Montgomery, ran from 1965 until 1968, reporting on various events associated with the civil rights movement. It reported on anything relevant to the movement, which included incidents of racial violence and injustice. On several occasions, it published stories of bizarre incidents that ended with individuals being committed to Searcy. One incident, published in Volume 3, Issue number 47 in November 1967, involved an African-American man who worked on a state road crew in Russell County, George Washington Pace. He was called to meet a white police officer at a drugstore in Hurtsboro. According to Pace, when he met the officer, he was attacked, beaten unconscious, and hospitalized. Mr. Pace's sister said his head was swollen and he was incoherent for over a week. But he was able to recount the attack to her after he had recovered in hospital in Phoenix City. Before she could learn more of the story from him, he was transferred to Searcy on the order of a Russell County judge who said he didn't really commit Mr. Pace to the hospital, but they were merely holding him until he was able to stand trial. The court and the hospital did not inform anybody of Mr. Pace's or any of Mr. Pace's family of his commitment until well after he had been moved from Phoenix City. Another is a story of a woman from Mobile, Inez Pruitt. Her story was published in June of 1967. After suffering an injury and being told she could not work by a Dr. William Thomas, Ms. Pruitt applied for welfare but was denied, and according to 3 white officials, struck a caseworker after she was verbally abused by that worker. The same Dr. Thomas, who was an intern, not a psychiatrist, and he said as much when the Southern Courier interviewed him, diagnosed Mrs. Pruitt as a paranoid schizophrenic and committed her to Searcy on May 24th, 1967. After several weeks in the hospital, a few friends managed to secure her release. However, during her commitment, Ms. Pruitt received 3 shock treatments without her consent, which after reading through several articles seems to be a common thing. In another article which outlines a patient's experience at Searcy, written by a former patient, they outline their daily experience, including the poor diet, the forced labor, and poor clothing that was provided. They also describe shock therapy as a punishment more than a treatment. The Courier seems to get every side of the story when recounting these events. In Mr. Pace's event, they interviewed the assaulting officer. In Ms. Pruitt's, they interviewed Dr. Thomas. Almost always, they interviewed the assistant superintendent, Dr. Harry Rowe, who comes off unsympathetic to say the least. Naturally, it is easy to dismiss these accounts of the other side and these stories because of their vested interest, whether it's misconstrued or not. More research is needed to verify these accounts and give us more perspectives rather than the binary perspective we are saddled with now. With what we know, Searcy lives up to the billing of a 20th century psychiatric hospital full of sad, forgotten patients, creepy doctors, and an abused system. However, we can't dismiss and leave it as another failure of a failed system. I need to be clear here. The deplorable conditions and questionable practices at Searcy Hospital in the first half of the 20th century and possibly the last half were not solely a result of institutionalized racism. It was also the inherent failure of how we as a society treat the mentally ill and how the legal system is continually abused to commit people indefinitely while denying their constitutional rights to due process and self-determination. The Courier, in another edition, accounts for a white NASA scientist who stubbed his toe on the street in downtown Huntsville, yelled, and stumbled to the ground. He was observed by 2 Huntsville police officers who promptly arrested him on charges of public drunkenness. While in city jail, the scientist insisted he merely stubbed his toe. But as his detainment continued, he became angry enough for the police to restrain him, and they had a Madison County judge commit him to Bryce for a 3-week observation period. Searcy operated as a desegregated hospital from 1969 until 2012. I'm going to push pause here. When it was closed indefinitely. In that time, 5 new buildings were built, including 3 new treatment facilities and a geriatric building. Now, it sits on top of a hill, forgotten by many and unfortunately remembered by a few. The closing of Searcy hit the town of Mount Vernon like the closing of a steel mill in a small Midwestern town. The hospital was the economic and community driver of the entire area. It employed local residents as janitors, police officers, nurses, and attendants, and it provided them with accessible medical care. The complex served that community for nearly 200 years. So now what? You're probably asking yourself at this point, why is this guy telling me about this? I'm here to hear about Andrew Jackson, Red Eagle, or the brave 3rd son of a South Carolinian planter who set off in the wilderness to fight Indians and grow cotton. Not some rundown arsenal turned hospital turned haunted house. Well, here it is. We can't forget this place. I'm here to advocate for history and telling our state's story. Searcy is one of the few places that has been around, been used, and lived in continuously for Alabama's entire existence as a recognized territory and state. From the cantonment to the rotting heap of buildings that's there on the site now, it stands as a testament to our society's best and worst times and provides a set of lessons that few places can. When I showed up at the commission, a group of folks, including Michael Panhorst and the Mount Vernon Historical Society, were doing everything they could to get someone to pay attention to the site. The Historical Commission was listening, but in the middle of other fights and did not have the resources to commit. The same could be said for the Department of Mental Health. To put it plainly, only a handful gave a damn. The site was listed to the National Register at the state level of significance in 1983. In the early 2000s, the top of one of the water tanks blew off in a tornado, barely missing the Arsenal building, clipping the roof of the historic post office, destroying the rear gable, and landing in the ravine. In 2016, Panhorst and others published a white paper discussing the history and the clear and present threat faced by the buildings and the complex, and needless to say, that threat is urgent. Before the hospital closed, the older buildings not being used were deteriorating. After the hospital closed in 2012, only a small security team remained. Buildings were locked, water was turned off, and electricity to the vast majority of the site was cut. It doesn't take long for a building not in use to fall apart, and it's only accelerated by the climate of lower Alabama, a place that receives more annual rainfall than just about anywhere else in the country. Throw humidity, violent storms, and a freeze-thaw cycle into that, and you've got what it takes to bring down a building in a couple of years. As I speak, every building built before 1950 has substantial roof damage. The same year the white paper was published, the roof and facade of the carpenter shop collapsed completely. Finally, after back and forth and providing limited support, the commission stepped up, sending me and a few of my colleagues to evaluate the situation, meet the Mount Vernon Historical Society, and a handful of their partners. We spent a day down there in March of 2017, and by that time, the roof of the Arsenal building had collapsed in a strong thunderstorm in October of 2016. That was the motivating event for me. Though the building had changed over time to fit the needs of the countless number of patients over the years, it still maintains much of its original construction, including its castellated turret, and, as I would later come to find out, the original structural members, which are 30 feet long and 2 feet thick. They simply do not grow trees like this anymore. After that site visit and further research, it was clear of the importance of the site in my own mind, and shortly afterwards, Panhorst and AHC's partners at the Alabama Trust for Historic Preservation managed to have drone photos of the site taken so we could understand the extent of the roof damage. Shortly after that, AHC committed a limited amount of grant funding matched by the Trust's Endangered Property Trust Fund to the Department of Mental Health to contract with Dick Hudgens to perform a triage survey of the buildings from the arsenal period and form a prioritized list of projects. After we received Dick's report and recommendations, DMH again contracted with him and AHC's help to begin repair of the roof of the arsenal building's turret. Independent of the physical project, the Trust and Panhorse worked in the past to have the complex recognized by the National Trust for Historic Preservation as a national treasure. During the summer of 2018, a field officer for the National Trust, not knowing about the National Treasure application, reached out to me looking for nominations for their 11 Most Endangered Places program. Mount Vernon Searcy was a natural fit. Its history is so broad, covering early America to Native American and African American history. The National Trust was on it, but after deliberation and initially being on the final list, it was removed because George Washington's home, Mount Vernon, was at that time threatened by the construction of a power plant upriver from the plantation, and NTHP leadership believed that there was room for only one Mount Vernon. Honestly, that was it for us. National recognition, only to have our proverbial cherry tree cut down at the last minute. As I say at the end of every Ole Miss football season, there's always next year. However, unlike the Greek tragedy that is my rebels, the NTHP has pledged its support to Searcy and the small coalition of preservationists that are fighting for it. They asked us to nominate the site again in 2019, all but assuring us it would not be booted by George Washington again. They also encouraged us to work with their newest program, the African American Action Fund, and of course continue our fight to have it recognized as a national treasure. While all this was happening, the Save America's Treasure program was randomly refunded by Congress, and it occurred to us, Searcy is eligible for that, as well as the National Park Service grant funding through their Civil Rights Sites grant and their African American Sites grant. Suddenly there was funding, but then our cherry tree did come crashing down. The Alabama Historical Commission doesn't own the site. It still belongs to the Alabama Department of Mental Health. They still make the decisions. Their priority is helping people who need it and need it now, helping guide practical solutions to public health. Understandably, preserving an abandoned site they no longer use does not fit that mission. We're at an impasse now. DMH is a valuable partner, and preserving the site and its history can only happen with them. And here's the plea. We need your help as historians and as Alabamians. Without interested partners, this historically significant place will come to ruin. These buildings will continue to fail, and this place will decay in silence and obscurity, leaving behind a limited written history. The story deserves more than that. It deserves the utmost we as citizens can provide. Saving these buildings is not just preservation for preservation's sake, but it strikes at the heart of good preservation. Saving a building to tell the story of our past and opening it to a new life. Searcy is huge, with more than 30 buildings. Each of them served a purpose and could serve a purpose once more. But a concerted community-based effort with a steady coalition and sound leadership can accomplish this monumental task. The reality is, not just the buildings need saving, but infrastructure does too. Sewage, water, electricity, and modern technology all need to be repaired, replaced, and updated. An organized community-led effort can do all of that, but not if there isn't one there to do it. And that is why I'm here making this plea for help, telling the story, bringing awareness to this effort. We've talked to Bradley Byrne and Terry Sewell. Members of the legislature are aware of the situation, and the Mobile County Public Health Department has made suggestions for possible uses, but nothing can happen if those people don't hear from their constituents. I know this is a Montgomery-centric event, but we all know someone who knows someone. So I charge you with this. Go tell people about Searcy. Stop in on your way to the beach or Mobile or New Orleans. Drive up to the gate, peer through the bars, see it for yourself. Read about it. The Southern Courier is available to the public thanks to Stillman College. And I'll send you a copy of the National Register nomination. Call me or Michael. We'll talk to you about it. We'll keep you updated. Support the Alabama Trust. Tell them you want to do something to support the Mount Vernon Historical Society. Call the National Trust of Historic Preservation. Stir stuff up. Because if we forget about it, we lose a significant chapter of our past, a significant piece of our story. We'll forget about our nation's early attempts to defend itself and Alabama's role as a part of the Union. We'll forget about the tragedy of the wars for the West and how our country grew. And we'll never learn the lessons of segregation and the calamity of mental health care. We'll lose a town and people like Inez Pruitt and George Washington Pace. The injustices suffered will go unrecognized. The countless unnamed graves in the cemetery will fade away, and those people and their story will be gone. There is hope yet, and with our partnership with the National Trust and a renewed sense of purpose, things can happen. And in words of the warrior poet and modern philosopher Jeff Lebowski, the dude abides. Thank y'all.